How's it going, everybody? This is Rusty here at FCP Euro, and today we're going to show you how to do the rear struts on our G01 X3 M40i. Now, as you see on the table, I have on my right the Bilstein B6s that we've chosen to go with on today's DIY, accompanied with the rear strut mount kit, as well as spring seats and all the accompanied hardware. On my left is the genuine unit we've replaced on this vehicle with the used strut mount and spring seats, just to give you a little bit of comparison as to what you may want to look for when you're getting your strut kit together. As you can see, the spring seats do have some wear from the original springs, and these strut mounts do tend to have a little bit of wear and can cause some knocking noises when getting worn out. Generally, a rule of thumb is about 60 to 100,000 miles. Our particular vehicle has about 80,000 miles, and there are no major signs of leaks or anything like that. We didn't have any clunking noises or anything. However, you can see a lot of the wear throughout the components. And you may be wondering why we chose the specific B6 strut. These struts do allow us to use the factory spring, which in this DIY we'll be reusing and just replacing the extra components. The B8s, however, if you were considering lowering your vehicle, would have a shorter strut travel and would be used for a lowering spring. And now that we've gone over everything on the table, let's get into some of the tools we'll need to take care of the job. To my right, we've got a couple of impact guns, getting a 1/2-inch impact gun for getting the wheels off, and we also have a small little impact driver. Got a 1/2-inch torque wrench, as well as a 3/8 torque wrench, a 1/2-inch drive ratchet, along with 2 extended wrenches in 18mm as well as 21mm, and then 2 normal size wrenches in 21 and 18 as well. In the front here, we have a small pickle fork kind of tool for getting some trim panels off, but you could also get away with just a small pocket screwdriver. Definitely going to be handy to have a couple of flashlights. We have a large screwdriver, but a pry bar will also work. And for sockets, we have a 8mm, an E12, a T40 Torx bit, as well as a T45 Torx bit, a small extension, 16mm, a 17mm, an 18mm, and a 21mm socket. Now over here on my left, we have 2 variations of the spring compressor, as well as the pass-through socket set. Definitely going to consider using one of these for removing and replacing your strut mounts. It's definitely going to make for a much easier process. The spring compressor, you can have either option here, as we understand that not everyone's going to have this nice spring compressor, but this is a much more readily available, cheaper option if that's something you're interested in. And last but not least, we do have a tape measure for making sure that we check our ride height before removing any components and getting back to that ride height before tightening things up. And now with that, let's go ahead and get into it. Now, before we get started, you do want to take a measurement of your ride height. A couple of things you want to keep in mind when doing your ride height. You want to make sure you don't have anything excess in the trunk. You want to make sure you have a full tank of gas and your tire pressure is set to the specification. So we're going to take a measurement of both sides. The general rule of thumb is going from the fender here to the center of the BMW logo, as we're not going to have the wheel on the vehicle when we're trying to tighten up some of the suspension. So you're going to go off a general center of the BMW logo here. And we've got about 440 to 445. So we want to keep that in mind when we're lifting the suspension up and tightening all the hardware. It's a good rule of thumb to have a measurement of all 4 corners, not just the 2 rears, and making sure that when you have the vehicle back down on the ground before tightening anything up, that you jounce the suspension from the rear of the vehicle, and also do not have your parking brake on. A lot of times the parking brake does set automatically, so keep that in mind. If you have the vehicle set with the parking brake on, it could be holding the vehicle up slightly. So just a couple things to keep in mind before we get started. And now we're going to move on to the trunk and get some accessibility to the top of the strut mounts. All right, now in the back of the vehicle, we are going to want to make sure that we have our seats folded before getting this panel out. It's going to make it a lot easier getting to those front fasteners. The panel right here just simply pops out of the D-pillar and slides up and away from this little groove down here. And it's the same on the other side. And there's a couple of small rivets here that we will need to remove. However, you actually have to start with the base plate and this track on the side before fully releasing the upper trim here. So there are a couple of fasteners in the track as well as in here. There are a T40 and a T45. Don't be fooled, they look very, very similar, but if you put the T40 in the T45, you're gonna do a number on that fastener and probably not be able to get that out. So just keep in mind, the fasteners towards the rear are a T40, and then the center and the rear are a 45. So with that, let's go ahead and remove those. Now the panel on the rear does have these little pieces that flip up, and it's a little difficult just with your thumb to get underneath there, so you may need a tool to kind of pop the panel up. And the same thing on the other side. And then these do have a T40. Wouldn't be a bad idea to make a little circle around there before removing that. That will give you a good place to put this back, as it does have a little bit of ability to move around and not center. So we'll get into that on the reinstallation. Now, once the panel is removed, you can see a piece of foam right here, and this is actually where the top of the strut mount is located, but you can only gain access to 2 of the fasteners, and the foam can't be fully removed. I know, it's kind of a pain. So we will continue the removal of this panel. We're going to get the 2 screws out of this track, as well as the one in the rear, and I mentioned before, the one towards the back of the trunk here, or I guess the front of the trunk, is the T40. And again, if I take my bit off of here and put it into the center one, you can hear how loose that actually is. That will definitely do some damage to that fastener. So with the T45 and that rear one, the rear one does have a square washer in there, and it is a slightly different color. So keep in mind the orientation of those pieces of hardware and making sure that you don't mix those up. But again, once that's loose, it does not still come all the way out. We will have to continue on this panel here before releasing that all the way. So once we had that side panel off, you can see there's one rivet here, and there's actually one tucked underneath this panel. When you go to pry this panel off, you want to make sure that you pry it up and not towards the front or towards the back, and I'll explain that once we get that off. You can simply use a little pocket screwdriver or a panel tool, but again, pry from the bottom in an upward fashion, as the 2 clips on the top section loop under, and then these ones hold it in. It does need to be pried off in an upward fashion so you don't damage those clips. And then there is a plastic rivet right here. Get that out. And then there's the one more in the back. Just kind of get your tool underneath it, and then the whole thing should be able to be removed. Now, the panel back here is loose on the top. However, it does have a little bit of difficulty looping around this, so we will have to kind of pull it up in a way. That's why we loosen this up as well, kind of keeping all the components loose all at the same time. So I'm going to have to fold this slightly. We want to make sure that we get the power outlet released before manipulating this panel so that we don't put any stress on that connection. Simply just grab the connector and pull and tuck that off to the side. There is no other connections on the back here. And as I said earlier, we do have to pull this panel kind of towards the front of the car. So I'm going to walk around the front and kind of get this out of the track of the groove here from the rear passenger doorway. So you'll notice it's tucked underneath here a little bit. We may have to pull on this just a hair to get this out, but picking up that back corner there and kind of pulling it out like that and turning it towards the front of the car will get that out. And keep that in mind going back in. You're going to want to keep that in the groove here. So you're going to want to kind of perform that same position and going back into that. Now that we've got the panel out, this thing simply should just slide out, but I think that bolt has rethreaded itself. So we may need to get this bolt out, and it's a little tricky inside the rail, so you may need a magnet. And then one more thing to keep in mind, there is a square washer in here. So when you take it out, you may want to just throw your thumb over that so you don't lose that square washer. And it should pull straight towards the front of the car. All right, now that we've dissected the trunk, we do have plenty of room to get that piece of foam out, giving us full access to the top strut tower bolts. Now this is going to be the same on the other side, minus the connector. So you're going to be pivoting that rear panel similarly to the other side, and you are going to have one of these panels that's going to have to flip upwards. So just keep that in mind when doing the other side. Now we're ready to get the vehicle up, get the wheels off, and proceed with removing that strut. Now, if you have a safety wheel lock, make sure you grab your wheel lock key from the trunk or from the glove box, wherever it may be. We're going to go ahead and take that wheel lock out first using a 17 and an impact gun. Certainly could get away with a breaker bar. All right, and now that we have the wheel off, we're going to get the vehicle up in the air a little bit further and continue on this DIY. Now with an 8mm socket, we're going to go ahead and remove the 2 screws that hold on this little airfoil on the bottom of the control arm. And then once you do that, you can position it to go out towards the brake rotor, sliding out of its place and tipping down and releasing. So it does have a little tab right here that engages on the end of the control arm. You just have to get this past that so that you can pivot it down and away. Now, before we go ahead and get started, you do have a couple of adjustment washers back here that do have an offset washer, commonly referred to as an eccentric washer. These are used for your alignment, and these are going to be removing and replacing with new hardware. So you are going to want to kind of make a mark on this and transfer that to your new hardware. This is going to make for the alignment process to go a little bit faster. We are actually trying to replicate the adjustments that you have on the vehicle currently, as we are assuming the alignment is close to spec, or at least close enough that the vehicle drives straight. So keeping that in mind, we are going to want to put our new hardware back into the same position. So we're going to just take a paint marker and mark out where the washer is sitting and trying to get that back into that same location. I've already done that over here. Camber bolts are already installed, and I've got them positioned in the same way that we had earlier. And just to make sure that our paint marker makes a good impression on there, we're just going to kind of clean the area with some simple green or some brake cleaner, anything of the sort, just kind of clean up the area before you go applying that, as it is a little bit dirty back here. Now we just want to find the highest point on these pieces of hardware. You can certainly do a line on either side. Do one here, and do one roughly there. Again, you are going to need an alignment. This is just going to make sure that the vehicle travels to the alignment shop, or gets aligned very efficiently and quickly by putting these back to the same spot. So they're not going to be exact, but when you transfer these to the new pieces of hardware, it'll be a little bit easier. These do not have the same tick marks or adjustment marks that the new pieces of hardware do, and I'll go grab those now and show you what we're talking about. So when setting up the new hardware, this is going to be your new toe adjustment bolt, which has a lot of tick marks in there. We are going to want to try to get to the most center point there and lining that up with our old marks. The washer is not going to have that same mark, but we can certainly take this washer, transfer that mark to the new one, and try to get those lined up to the same point that we had earlier. So the new bolts do have these adjustment marks, which make it a lot easier in trying to get your marks transferred over to the new hardware. Now, before we go ahead and compress any of the suspension, we are just going to crack the 3 pieces of hardware loose on this lower camber arm. You do have an 18 on the heads of the bolt. This nut here is a 21 millimeter. And then on the back side, there's a little doorway to the head of the bolt here, which we'll get into in a second. So on the outside, we're going to use an 18 on the head of the bolt and a 21 on the nut, and just break these loose before we have any jacks underneath the car. And then for this one, there is a little doorway on the back that we'll have to open up in order to gain access to that piece of hardware. And it does have a provision where you can kind of lock the doorway out of your way. All right, we're just going to get a pull jack over here to compress the suspension, as this is under load. So we will need to raise this slightly just to get the load off of these pieces of hardware so they don't drag on removal. So I do have a pull jack here. You can certainly use a jack stand or something of the equivalent. Now we're going to start to take these out, and if they begin to drag, we can either raise or lower this, and kind of keeping an eye on the bolt and the hole as well. You'll be able to remove that when the tension is at the exact perfect point. So counter holding this bolt with an 18, we're going to be working on the outermost bolt here. That came off pretty easily. And actually, as you can see, I'm able to move this bolt in and out of here with ease. If you're not able to do that, you may need to bring the knuckle up or down. I got lucky, very lucky here, and I'm able to remove this bolt without any strain on the knuckle, because this is actually sprung by the control arms wanting it to go up, and the spring is obviously pushing this control arm down. So again, I got very lucky here. I probably made that look way too easy on camera. And we're going to set this bolt off to the side. Now we want to bring this down slightly. The knuckle will pop out of the end of the control arm here, so be aware as you're lowering this that the knuckle may jump on you a slight amount. All right, and now the knuckle is free. This is still under a little bit of tension, so we're going to go back up just a hair. And now we're going to work on that lower eyelet bolt for the shock. It's also an 18 and a 21, just like that outer bolt. Now this is what I was talking about on that outer bolt, where we are seeing some resistance upon removing the bolt. And we may be able to see on the back here, looks like the bolt is being forced downward. So we are probably going to have to lower this a little bit to get the tension off that bolt so it doesn't drag. So kind of keeping an eye where everything is at, seeing where the stress is at, and it looks like we're right at that point where we can release that. So you're going to want to keep the jack or jack stand underneath this, because as you take this bolt out, and we've already loosened that, this arm's going to want to swing out of the way. And I'm just using the impact gun with my fingers behind the head of the bolt to spin that out and walk that out. And now the strut is nice and free in there. So if we go ahead and lower this down, get that out of our way, should be able to pull down on this arm, swinging this out of our way. Now we have plenty of room to get that strut out of our the body of the car. but I'm gonna put a moving blanket down here. We're gonna go into the trunk. I'm gonna zip those bolts off, allowing the strut to kind of drop down and out. There's no wiring in here to be worried about. The sway bar link should be okay. You're not gonna obviously want this thing to fall from too far, so get the vehicle down, maybe have a couple of blankets or something underneath to catch the strut. But the only thing we're gonna be reusing is the spring, so you just wanna make sure we don't chip the paint on that spring. Certainly wouldn't be a bad idea to have a second person here while you're releasing the hardware up top. However, it's just me, so we're gonna get the car back down and we'll be up in the trunk getting the top strut mount bolts out. All right, now that we're back in the rear of the car, we're gonna get to these strut mount bolts. We're just gonna break them all free and then go back and zip them all out. And now, as I mentioned before, if you don't have a friend handy, make sure you have something underneath the strut as it's about to fall out of the car. All right, and there you have it. We've removed the strut with the spring assembly, and we're gonna go ahead and swap this over on the bench. So now that we've got the strut assembly over on the bench, there is one little talking point I wanted to mention. The rear struts, unlike the front, do not have a bearing on top, so they're not able to be turned and manipulated to get into place. And as you saw, these had a fixed point on the bottom, which pretty much has to be lined up every time you go to put it back in. With that, there is an indication on the top here that has an arrow where the upper spring seat and the top strut mount meet each other. This arrow kind of lines up with one of the sides of the lower eyelet on the strut, whereas this side doesn't really have an arrow. So when you take it out, the arrow will be lining up with one of the eyelets. Just something to keep in mind so that when the strut goes back into the control arm, you have 4 points up here that are fixed. And if this is 90 degrees off, you will have to either compress the springs to turn the strut, or with our Bilsteins, we have a seat that actually spins slightly. So this may scratch the paint a little bit, and to alleviate from that, you can set it up with the eyelet close to or slightly offset from this arrow. As you can see on this old assembly that we've removed from the car, this is unable to be moved because this has a fixed spring seat to the factory strut. So if you're watching this video replacing it with some OE or OEM replacements or even genuine units, you're gonna wanna be very cognizant of how this goes back together. And you may even have an issue where you get this back in the car, attach these 4 bolts to the top of the body, and then you'll have to use a spring compressor to get this to line up into the control arm. But we'll get into that later once we get this into the car. So I'm gonna use our spring compressor, and this does have 3 different jaws. We're gonna use the medium-sized jaws on the spring compressor. We're gonna try to get this into the center of the springs here, and we may need to adjust this as we get the jaws closer. I'm gonna grab an impact gun and get this tightened up. We're gonna just go on the 2 or 3 center springs here, keeping us a little bit far away from the top mount as well as the lower spring seat. That way we can manipulate this in the future if we need to. So we're just gonna get this close to it and monitor the spring as it begins to compress. There is a groove on the center of the U shape here that you wanna make sure gets on the inside of that spring. At this point, the strut mount is loose and the spring is loose from here. So we're able to go ahead and release our gun from that. Careful, this spring is under a lot of tension, so don't be moving this around too much. So as you can see here, the top of the strut mount does have a 16mm nut fastening the nut to the strut, but the center of that does have a provision for a 5mm Allen, which we'll be using in our pass-through socket set kit. So we're gonna use the 16 on the outside and counter holding the Allen in the center. Slide that back, make sure we get this all the way in there. And that's pretty much what it takes to break it free. Not very much. I believe, if I recall correctly, the torque was about 28 Newton meters. And there you have it, a completely disassembled rear strut assembly. We still have tension under the rear spring because we're gonna be swapping that over to our Bilstein strut. So I'm gonna get rid of all this stuff and bring over all of our new components to the table. All right, now that we have the new strut over here, I mentioned in the beginning of the video, some assembly required. If you'll notice, the factory strut spring seat did have a fixed unit on that. There is a little collar on here where this will sit, so there's no like fastening this. It should spin quite easily, and we will need that for once we get this back into the car, as I was discussing the position of this eyelet. So that's that, and then we do have 2 new additional spring seats. Smaller one's gonna go on the bottom, and the larger one's gonna attach to the strut mount itself. just slide this over. There is no provision for this to sit in any particular fashion, and there's no provision on the spring seat either. So this will just kind of sit here, and we will drop the spring onto here and then line that up with the top strut mount. There is a little lip in here. When you go put the spring on, you want to make sure that this lip is kind of folded in and goes over the inside of the spring. Got the new strut mount here, and if you remember, we talked about those arrows. There's going to be an arrow on the upper spring seat as well as an arrow on the strut mount. Line up those two arrows and they should more or less lock together, and you can see that right there. They sandwich in nicely. They don't spin or twist. So these do have a provision where they want to sit in the specific spot, and it's very key because it does have a specific point for the spring to start on. So we'll put this off to the side. We're going to take off our 17mm nut and washer from the new strut. So 5mm again. However, the new nut is going to be a 17 as opposed to a 16. It's right there. And then one more thing, we want to grab our bellows, and then there's also, once you've got the spring seat on, there is a little cap here. This cap sits over the top of the seal, and it allows the bottom of the bellows to pretty much keep the bottom covering the rest of the strut shaft. So we are going to want to push this down, and it is a rather tight fit, so you may need to get a rubber mallet to get this fully seated. Make sure it's all evenly pressed down. You don't want this thing cracking on you and knocking around. All right. Next, we're going to throw we're going to put this inside of the strut mount. This does sit inside of the strut mount quite easily. You may even need a little bit lube because it is a somewhat tight fit. Once you get that engaged, it's not going to go anywhere. You can kind of pull on it, make sure it's seated. Now that we have that ready to go, I'm going to take the spring, and if you did not already make a note of the orientation, there is a specific top and bottom to this spring. Good rule of thumb would be to put a paint mark on the top or the bottom just so that you're aware, and putting it back together, you don't have it mixed up. However, the strut mount will not fit on the bottom. The bellows will not go through. We'll only allow it to go through the top, finding its home here, and you can see that that will not allow you to install it the other way. If you try to install it the other way, you might get it together, but it's obviously not going to fit correctly. So keep that in mind. There's also, in some cases, a small little tag here you can see in the center of the spring. It's generally closer to the bottom, but they are glued on there, so over time they may fall off. They may start to loosen themselves up and go all the way to the bottom. So just keep in mind where your top of your spring is as well as where the bottom of your spring is. And I'm just going to bring this over here so you guys can see the top of the strut assembly. So we're going to put our strut mount through the top, and we want to make sure that the end of the spring ends right here. There is actually a little notch where the spring should sit, and it should not sit any further away from that. You could create some squeaks, some noises. We just want to make sure that is fully engaged there. We can always go back and adjust that before we release the tension from the spring compressor, so keep that in mind. As far as the bottom, we do want to make sure that the spring gets spun underneath this little lip here. If you don't get the spring underneath this lip, you can actually create some noise and prematurely wear this in a pretty poor fashion. So we're going to get this into the bump stop, hopefully lining that up good. So we're going to start the spring seat right at the beginning of the spring here. And luckily for us, if you're doing genuine or OE struts, you're not going to have this ability. You'll have to spin the whole strut, but we're able to just spin the coil spring seat here, and there's a provision on this spring seat that says start spring. So basically you want to spin this until it gets to that point, and the top of our strut is actually sticking out, so we don't have to compress this anymore. The strut is fully extended. Put our washer that comes on the strut on there, this one on there, and before we tighten anything up, double check your start of your spring, and then that little overlapping portion of the bottom of the spring seat, as well as the start up here. Once you get this tightened up and you're releasing that, we're also going to want to keep an eye on how the spring kind of settles, because it may shift in or out of those points. So with a 17, as the new Bilstein strut does have a slightly larger piece of hardware, tighten that up, get our 5mm in the center there, counter holding. We're just going to get this snugged up and then recheck the fitment of our spring before we give this a final torque and release the spring tension. All right, that's good enough. Again, you want to double check, make sure your spring is sitting in the correct position. We do have the ability to spin this strut a little bit to line up that eyelet. So we want to look for those arrows we were talking about. Now I mentioned they're not going to be exactly in line, but if you at least have the spring tension off, We can spin this slightly against the strut mount, holding the strut mount and spinning the bottom of the strut body to kind of get a close enough orientation to that arrow. Once we get the vehicle, the strut back in the vehicle, we can move this slightly, but it's going to be under that spring tension, so you're going to have a lot more difficulty, which is why I say to get it close to that arrow, and you can fine tune it by a little bit. You won't want to have to do a full 90-degree turn and be very far away from that arrow. So again, double check before you release your spring tension to make sure everything is fully seated. I can already tell up here, this spring seat has moved slightly. Get this back over here. That's that. Arrows in close. Grab my spring seat, and that's good enough. That's that. All right, I think that's enough double checking. So when we release this, we want to make sure that that spring sits in there good as well. So keep an eye on it as you slowly loosen this up. You may even want to loosen it a couple turns and double check and make sure nothing's come out of place. And take a look, make sure your spring starts there and should finish in the similar location. We'll check our arrows. They are pretty much in line with our eyelet. We may have to twist this slightly, but with the aftermarket assembly, having that two-piece spring seat, I do have the ability to move this slightly where you don't have that ability with the genuine or OE. And now that we've got the assembly all back together, we do just want to make sure that that top strut mount is torqued to 28 Newton meters, and you do not want to do that while counter holding that. You can end up stripping out that center point if you're using that as a counter hold. You really want to leave that for the disassembly. It's going to make things a lot easier if you don't put any added torque on that when tightening that. So we're just going to put a hand on this and torque this up to 28 Newton meters. There we go. All right, now we're going to take this back over to the car and finish up our rear strut installation. All right, now if you have a friend handy like I do in the trunk here, guide your strut up and have them tighten up the 4 top nuts here. And we're going to leave those just gently loose so that it gives us a little bit more of that room that I was talking about to line up the eyelet for the bottom of the strut. So guide that up, communicate with your buddy in the trunk, just hold it in place while they're fished in there. I don't know about you, but my arms are definitely not long enough to get into the trunk from here. And you'll notice that there is some slotted holes up there. So when we leave them loose, that'll give us a little bit of articulation to get that eyelet hooked up. If you're using the genuine struts, this will definitely be very beneficial. You won't have to worry about the spring compressor. All right, now that we have those snugged up, we're gonna get the car back up. I just wanted to show you a little bit of play that we do still have in here, and we want this bit of play. If you tighten those all the way, you're not gonna be able to move this strut and get that lined up down below. So we'll get the car back up in the air and we'll catch you guys in a second. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we may have issues with the eyelet of the lower section of the strut lining up with the control arm, and as you can see here, it is not quite articulated correctly. Luckily, with the two-piece B6 strut here, we can put a long screwdriver or even an extension in there and pivot this slightly. We've also got a little bit of play from those upper strut mounts, but we're going to push this just a little bit that way so that we can line this up, and that will pretty much fall into place when we need it to. And just like that. Now we're going to go get our pole jack and push this control arm up, and to get the fastener lined up, we may need to pull the knuckle into place to get that in there as well. So it is going to be a little bit of a dance, making sure that we don't push up on the knuckle, but we'll get this lined up closely, and we're almost there actually. So I'm going to see if that stays there. I'm going to go grab my new piece of hardware, put that in, and then we'll guide that back up into the knuckle. All right, once we have our hole lined up, we can kind of fine tune it with a screwdriver to get that eyelet perfect, and then we're able to put that bolt in there with ease. We may have to bend the control arm just a hair to get that to line up good. There we go. And then we're just going to lightly fasten the nut on there, and we'll torque that down once we get the suspension compressed. All right, now the easiest course of action to get the spindle lined up with the control arm bolt hole here is going to be to actually compress that strut and kind of pull down on the knuckle. So it's going to be a little bit of a dance. We are going to have to move the bottom of the control arm forward so that it actually catches that knuckle, and pull the knuckle back slightly as we're lifting that up. So keep that in mind as you're lifting it up. It may catch the sides of the little ball joint bushing in here, and we're just gonna have to be cognizant of that as we're bringing that up so that you're not pushing the knuckle up aside from just the control arm into the knuckle. Here we go. Once you get a little pressure on there, you may need to pull it back and just line it up with one hand while you got this going up. And we're getting pretty lucky here. So I am going to be reusing the old bolt, but in a later DIY, we're going to be going ahead and replacing all these control arms. So be sure to subscribe to check out that DIY. And now we're going to have to do the same thing that we did earlier, where we articulated the control arm just slightly, pushing up on the front side of it while we kind of spin the bolt in. You may even have to adjust your pull jack a little bit to make it easier to spin in, which it is exactly doing. We're just going to lightly fasten this piece of hardware as well. And now that we have the hardware installed all loosely, we are going to have to compress the suspension to ride height to make sure that we don't prematurely wear the bushing on the bottom of the strut, and make sure that the bushing on the outside here, as well as the adjustment in here for the camber setting, is all torqued at ride height. Now, if you remember from the earlier section of the video, we did get a measurement of around 440 millimeters. It's going to be different with everyone's vehicle, but we want to make sure that we get that close to where the vehicle was. So going off the center point of this axle bolt, we are right at about 440 millimeters. So we should be good to tighten up all those pieces of hardware. Now, from the outside of the control arm towards the inside of the control arm, the fastener that is to the knuckle is 165 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. This one here that attaches the strut to the control arm is 100 Newton meters plus 90. And then the camber bolt on the inside is 175 Newton meters with no 90 degree. These are all one-time use pieces of hardware. We're just going to be snugging these up, and I'm going to be torquing these in an additional video. So if you want to see the torque sequence, please reference the rear control arm replacement video. But we're just going to, again, snug these up so that they are at a fixed point, and we're going to be going ahead and taking this apart shortly after this video. So just like removal, the head of the bolt is an 18 and the nut is a 21. And then on this one, we are going to want to be cognizant of where the adjustment is, as we did make some marks on here and they did move slightly. So I'm going to bring that back to right about where we had our marks, and we're going to just snug this one down. Now, if you're getting the vehicle aligned after this, you're going to want to put a new camber bolt in there and snug that down just enough to get the vehicle over to the alignment shop and have the fastener torqued down after it's adjusted. As even though we are marking these, there will still need to be some adjustment to both of these components, so consider replacement when you are loosening and replacing these. That should be good enough for now. Now we can go ahead and get our spring compressor out of here, lowering this down carefully and getting this back out of the way. Now, if you were getting the vehicle down on the ground and tightening your fasteners actually on the four wheels like we discussed earlier, you may want to wait to have this installed, as this is going to cover up a lot of your fasteners. So there is a little bit of a lip here that needs to catch the outer portion of the lower control arm. Just make sure that seat's in there. You can kind of see it through the provision inside here. And then we are gonna, came out of there, and then it's gonna kind of clip into place and shimmy into place for the bolts to go into the provisions in the control arm. The torque spec on these small fasteners is about 3 Newton meters, so do not over tighten them. They're very small screws that go into a fairly fragile piece of plastic. And if you recall, we did leave our top strut mounts loose. So we're gonna get the vehicle back down and put the wheel on, putting some pressure against the strut to the body, and then tightening up those upper strut mounts, making sure that the strut is securely pressed against the body when we tighten those up, not allowing the bolts to pull the strut up towards the body. So with that, let's throw the wheel back on and we'll catch you guys in the trunk. Personally, I like to put the wheel lock opposing the tire valve here. It just makes for a little bit more uniform fitment and keeps everything kind of in line, but that's just me. Once we get these down on the ground, we're going to be torquing these to 140 Newton meters and then double checking them again down the road. All right, now we're going to tighten up these external Torx E12 fasteners to 28 Newton meters plus a 90-degree turn. I'm going to go around and get them all to 28, and then I'll go back and do that final 90. Now, as always, if you don't have a tech angle torque wrench, you can certainly get away with just a pen mark. Keep in mind that these do have washers underneath, so if you're going to mark the head of the bolt, be sure to mark the body, not the washer, as the washer may turn with the bolt head. All right, now before we start reassembling some of the trunk components, take note of the points where you're going to be putting in the fasteners. Make sure there's no dirt and debris that came down from the cowl or the panel that you removed here. When you took this down, there could have been some dirt and stuff that got stuck in there or in that track. As you saw, we did have a small screw that we found that had been left in there from a previous owner. Make sure all this whole area is clear of anything that could disrupt the screw from fastening itself in here, as this is part of the body. So if you cross thread this, you are going to have a hard time getting that repaired. So this does look pretty clean. Just want to wipe away anything that may fall in there before we go fit that up. So if you recall, we also had the track in here first and then put the panel in. So want to just put that foam in and get that track ready to go. And the foam does have an arrow pointing to the front of the car, as it only does fit in one way, but BMW was nice enough to give us a little assistance there. And that'll fit in there nice like that. And again, as we noticed when we took these apart, there are a couple of different fasteners. So the T40 is going to go in the rear, the T45 in the darker colored bolt there, and the raw steel bolt here is the T45 is going to go on the rear with the square washer. So just wanted to reiterate that in case you lost those bolts or got them mixed up. I'm going to pop this rear one up a little bit so we can fit this in here. You're going to want to leave this a little bit loose. If you recall from when we pulled this panel out, it was very helpful to getting that panel kind of articulated out of there without dragging on anything. So before we finish tightening this up, we're going to fit that one panel right here, and I'm going to go over to the front of the car here to kind of show you how to put that in. With the lower panel loose, you're going to want to kind of start it underneath this panel here, keeping in mind that there is a hard metal hook here for the seat receptacle to lock into. That is going to sit in here. So we're going to kind of line that up, tuck this in here. This is where it's going to get a little tricky, but this is also why it's nice to have the trim panel loose here. So try to do this a different way. This is probably a little easier. So putting it into the bottom of the track and then just kind of resting it back here. Don't go ahead and secure these clips yet, because we do still need to pull this back and set up that power cable. So you can't really screw this one up. It does have two opposing connectors, so just line those up, slide that on, and then line that back up. We have two plastic rivets we're going to pop into there. And don't forget your panel that you popped out earlier. The top of it does have these two little clips that kind of tip in, if you will. So you're going to kind of want to put it up in this angle and bring it down, attaching those clips like that. We're just going to start these bolts and then drop in the trunk panel before finalizing the torque on the track here. All right, and that pretty much takes care of today's DIY on the rear strut replacement on our X3. If you guys enjoyed today's video, please hit that like button. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't forget to get down in the comments section below. We'll have plenty more videos on this vehicle and many others like it, so please don't forget to subscribe. We may even have some modifications on this vehicle in the future. So thank you guys so much for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.